Most Indian goods entering the U.S. market will now attract a 50% duty, with a few exceptions. The initial 25% tariff came into effect on August 7, and this latest hike, announced earlier in the month, adds another 25%. The United States' 50% tariff on Indian goods came into effect at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 9:31 a.m. IST today, following the addition of a second 25% duty to the earlier hike imposed this month. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security confirmed that the higher tariff applies to all Indian goods entered for consumption or withdrawn from warehouse for consumption on or after this time. This move marks the culmination of President Donald Trump's tariff strategy aimed at nations maintaining economic ties with Russia, with India singled out for its purchase of Russian crude oil and military equipment. The decision has drawn sharp criticism from New Delhi, while Moscow has expressed support for India's right to choose its trade partners. With this increase, most Indian goods entering the U.S. market will now face a 50% duty, barring some exceptions. The first 25% tariff was implemented on August 7, followed by this latest hike announced earlier this month. This escalation is part of President Donald Trump's tariff campaign against countries maintaining economic ties with Russia, with India targeted for its purchase of Russian crude oil and defense equipment. New Delhi has strongly condemned the move, while Moscow has supported India's trade autonomy. With this step, most Indian goods entering the U.S. market now face a 50% duty, with some exceptions. Below is a sector-wise impact assessment. Textiles and apparel. The U.S. is India's largest textile buyer, with exports exceeding $10.8 billion annually. The sector now faces effective duties of nearly 64%, severely hurting hubs like Tirupur in Tamil Nadu, which employs over 600,000 workers. Gems and jewelry exports worth $9.94 billion to the U.S. will now attract 52.1% duties. Surat, which processes 80% of India's diamonds, is already reporting order cancellations and job losses. Shrimp and seafood. India exports around $2.4 billion in shrimp to the U.S., which accounts for half of its seafood trade. With duties now at 60%, Indian suppliers risk losing ground to Ecuador, whose shrimp face only 15% tariffs. Carpets, furniture, and home textiles. Carpet exports of $1.2 billion will now face nearly 53% effective duties, pushing U.S. buyers toward competitors such as Turkey and Vietnam. Leather and footwear. The entire sector, a major employer in states like Uttar Pradesh and Tamil Nadu, is now subject to the full 50% tariff, compounding challenges from rising input and freight costs. Auto components. Indian auto parts exports to the U.S. stood at $6.6 billion in 2024. Of this, $3.4 billion will face a 25% duty, while the remainder will be hit with 50% tariffs, threatening India's market share in key components like gearboxes. Chemicals and organic compounds exports worth $2.7 billion, much of it SMA-driven, will face steep tariffs of over 50% at countries like Japan and South Korea, which enjoy preferential access, are set to benefit. Agricultural and processed foods. Basmati rice, tea, spices, and other agri-food products worth $6 billion will now face 50% duties, opening opportunities for rivals like Pakistan and Thailand. Pharmaceuticals. Generic drug exports of $10.52 billion remain exempt for now, though U.S. pressure on companies to localize manufacturing could rise. Electronics. Electronic goods exports of $14.64 billion, including iPhones assembled in India, are currently excluded under earlier bilateral arrangements. Petroleum products and others. Exports of petroleum products worth $4.1 billion are exempt, along with categories like books, plastics, and some industrial inputs. The steep tariffs strike hardest at India's MSMEs, which contribute over 70% of export capacity in textiles, gems, seafood, and chemicals. Concentrated in clusters like Tirupur, Surat, and Panipat, these firms operate on razor-thin margins and depend heavily on U.S. demand. The 50% duty virtually erases their price competitiveness, threatening widespread job loss.